When the women leaned in to negotiate assertively for higher pay, there was this decline in people's willingness to work with them as compared to if they let the opportunity pass. That doesn't mean that they can't get around it. I mean, I've actually done a lot of research looking at what are the strategies that women can use in order to both be persuasive and assertive, but then also avoid some of that social cost.
I'm Stan Christensen, and this is All Things Negotiation. Today, my guest is Hannah Riley Bowles. Hannah is a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School, where she teaches negotiation. In our conversation today, we talk about gender and negotiation, where she is an expert. We talk about women's advancement and negotiations involved there. We talk about work-family conflict. It's a fascinating conversation. I just really enjoyed it. Hannah Riley Bowles, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I've been excited for this one. I think I've done about 30 interviews, and you are the person that I have known the longest of all of my guests. And so we have a long history, and I know we're going to have a fun conversation because we're going to talk about gender and negotiation. And you and I started that conversation almost 30 years ago. The question I get most frequently, and I know you get it as well from students, is do men and women negotiate differently? What do you say when kids ask that?
So my first line very often when I do gender negotiation is that men and women do not reliably behave differently in negotiation. That said, there are a lot of papers on gender and negotiation, and the way we get them is by being attuned to the situations in which these effects do tend to arise. So there are reliable effects, but really only under particular conditions. And many years ago, back in the time when you and I first met, there was a really significant difference. Men were more likely to negotiate for higher pay than were women. Over time, that gap has actually been closing. Nonetheless, so right now we're at a stage where you get graduates from these elite MBA programs, both men and women are negotiating for higher pay at about the same rates. But then if you ask others, who do you think negotiates more often, men or women? The general perception is that men are going to be significantly more likely to negotiate than the women are. And then if you ask them who's more likely to be successful, they also say that the men are more likely to be successful than the women are. But to the extent to which we continue to push that belief, then it's that much stranger when a woman does lean forward and negotiate, like she's doing something kind of counter-normative. Who are you? Are you different? And the women also report higher levels of resistance to their negotiation attempts. But I think we want to hold both things at the same time. That is, yeah, we do see these effects, and it's really important to be aware of them, particularly in something like a pay negotiation. And I think it's so great that you teach negotiation and equip your students to lean in and do these things. But we also have to be careful to recognize that, this is not inevitable that there are these differences. And actually, one of the things that makes differences go away is negotiation training.
Absolutely. And you and I, were trained, in the Roger Fisher methodology, and I still teach some of that to my students. Academics are great at frameworks, and I know you have a bunch of them. So if you're advising women on how to prepare, because if you're prepared, you're going to do better, right? If you're willing to engage and prepare. So any frameworks that come to mind of how you help women or men prepare for negotiations?
Yeah, so I have this S.U.R.E framework that I use. B.S.U.R.E is the acronym, and it's got 4 steps for each of the S.U.R.E. And the first one is start with your goals. And that is just so critically important because one of the things, and I'm sure you see this also, Stan, is you're advising these young professionals who are getting offers, and then they're so focused on comparing one offer to the other and maybe not actually thinking about what their long-term goals are. They get comparing, these guys are offering me this and these guys are offering me that. And you very often have to sit them down and say, well, wait a minute, what is it that you actually want to do? And again, this is where gender might come into play. You might have differences in terms of men's and women's aspirations. Who wants to have more flexible work arrangements? Who wants to, do work that's socially meaningful or something like that. I think we have to allow for gender and other things to influence what the goals are. But the first thing is to start with the goals. The second thing I encourage people to do is understand what you're negotiating. And this is something we really learned from looking at what mid-career and senior executives negotiate. And that is the realization that a lot of times in our classes, Stan, when we run negotiation trainings, what we're doing is we're looking at fairly structured negotiations. We tell our students here are the issues and then there are the options for resolving these issues. And there are negotiations that are like that in the real world where they're pretty standard. People know what they're doing. And we call those asking negotiations. But what we saw was we went out and talked to these executives about what they were negotiating. We also saw a lot of them were saying, like sometimes the students do in our class, I don't really want all the options that you're giving me. I want to come up with a creative solution that deviates from the rules. And we call that bending. And then there was a third type of negotiation that we observed that's really about leadership. And that is to say, I don't want something standard for myself. I'm not looking for a special arrangement for myself. What I want to do is I want to lead change. I have a vision for how we can work together differently as a team, how we could do something differently within the organization, how we should set off and create some new venture. And if you're in a standard negotiation, you're going to use different arguments than you would use if you're negotiating for a special exception. And you would use different arguments if you're trying to lead change than in either of those other situations where you're trying to negotiate something kind of specifically for yourself. And a lot of times I find, maybe particularly with young professionals, but also with mid-careers and executives, that it's really useful to sit back and say, okay, well, really, what are you proposing? I mean, is what you're asking for something standard that they're going to immediately recognize? Is actually what you have in your head something that's going to kind of blow their mind a little bit because it's not the way we do work around here? Or are you actually going to need to build a whole coalition to get people behind what you're proposing? That like, this is not a yes or no, can you do this? Like, you actually have to build a coalition for change. So then my third R in the S.U.R.E is reduce ambiguity. And then particularly, I think this is helpful for women or folks, not only women, but other folks who may find themselves in the minority in their organizations. We've done some work on people from emerging economy and global corporations, or folks from historically marginalized backgrounds, things like race or social class within the United States. And so it's particularly important if you're not from the dominant group and you're not really connected to what are the norms about how to negotiate or what you could negotiate. So it's really important that you understand what is negotiable, how to negotiate, what people care about. And then the last part, the E of this framework, is enhance your negotiations through relationships and vice versa. That is, enhance your negotiations and relationships, tap your networks, but then also try to enhance your relationships through your negotiations. And that goes back to this Roger Fisher stuff. And we always had the separate people from the problem, focus on relationships, use legitimate, arguments. And so what we've found is, now this goes back to the strategies of how do you get around that anticipated resistance that women are concerned about entering some negotiations. What we've found, we ran a lot of experiments. We used a lot of different scripts that we got from coaches as well as negotiation faculty and senior executives. And the two core parts of the strategy were figure out what is legitimate in the eyes of the other party. So like a lot of times you hear from people, I deserve a raise because I work really hard. Well, that may be legitimate in your own mind why you should be paid more, but that's not how organizations, set compensation standards, obviously. And so you have to think about, like, what are those standards that are legitimate in the eyes of the other person? And then how are you appealing to their interests? So let me actually tell you one story that always stuck with me of a female executive. So she told me that she had discovered for the second time that men who were reporting to her were being paid more than she was within the organization.
Wow.
Yeah, wow, exactly. And so you can imagine, like, you have this flood of emotion, you're angry, you're frustrated, maybe even demoralized by finding this. But what she did is she kind of let all of that pass. And then she thought through, like, how am I going to approach this? And she went to them and she said, I know you're going to want to change this because this is inconsistent with our values and practices. And so I'm just going to leave this with you. And it was so beautiful. It was so strong on her part because she's basically saying in a very calm way, we have shared values, we have principles in this organization, and I know you're going to be on my side to get this fixed without there ever needing to be a conflict or anything. And they certainly fixed it.
Wow, that's so good. In an age of transparency and compensation, I always tell people, look, whether you think your employees are going to know what each other are paid, they're all going to find out. And so you want to have a compensation system that kind of withstands the test of transparency. In my experience, one of the reasons that men are paid more, often paid more, is what we talked about earlier. They just advocate for themselves at a greater extent. And so when a woman asks me, should I incur the social cost of asking for more? One of my pieces of advice is I just say, and it's a little different than the story that you just shared. I say, if I'm the woman, go to your manager and say, look, I just want to make sure that I'm paid similarly to men in similar roles across the organization.
Yeah.
And if you can tell me that I am being paid, then I'm not going to push more. But I want to know that I'm being paid at least equally the way that men are going to be paid. And these days, organizations, at least in this country, are going to have a hard time separating the pay from men from women. And so I find that women often get bumped up in salary when they do that in negotiation.
I love that. I love that. I mean, I think that's very consistent with this idea that we talk about a relational account or something like that. Basically saying, I love the organization, I want to do the work here, and I want to be paid fairly. And I think that's a shared value we would have. And can you reassure me on that? I love that. I hear from a lot of women questions about whether or not they're actually being fairly paid. And the other thing that's actually really important about this is that sometimes people confuse the gender wage gap with comparable pay in the same job. So the gender wage gap is just comparing, the 80 cents in the dollar or whatever it is that you hear about, is really just comparing full-time male and female workers. So it's not controlling for the jobs that people are in. And actually, once you control for the jobs that people are in, the gap doesn't go away, but it meaningfully shrinks. And so very often what I advocate for is not getting too focused on the pay negotiation, that if your primary focus is lifetime earnings, focus on negotiating yourself into better and better jobs. Because I think that women, even if the only issue that you're worried about is the gender pay gap, I think it's smarter for us to be leaning in, encouraging women to keep their careers growing and getting them into better and better jobs than encouraging them to ask for like a little more money in the job that they're in. I think usually in organizations, you get a much bigger bump as you move up to higher levels of responsibility, or if you stretch and go for a high growth enterprise, then you're going to get if you just stay in the role that you're in and bargain with your manager for a little higher pay.
It's so good. I think that the reason that I think pay is focused on to such a great extent is academics like you study it, and it's easy to measure. And the measurable things aren't the most important things. One of the areas, and I want to move into this because you're an expert in it, is women in career advancement and how that relates to family. Because it's the thing, when you and I first started talking about this in the 90s, I think we both would have assumed that in this country, we would have made more progress on women in the workplace and how they balance, family responsibilities, and men and how they balance family responsibilities. But I would say I've personally been very disappointed. And so give us a sense of women in career advancement, in addition to looking at the whole career. What are the key negotiations they have, and how do you advise women on career advancement?
So the first thing is role. I mean, I go back to thinking about really what do you want to do. Role is also really important because in that interface with flexibility, I hear so often young women or young couples saying to me, we're paying as much in childcare as my wife is earning, and what are we doing? Like, why are we paying for somebody to help take care of our kids? I could be home and doing this. But then they're not thinking about the costs of stepping out completely from the workforce if they have professional aspirations, or if they feel as a couple like they're going to need to actually have dual incomes to, say, pay for college, because once you step out, you just compare somebody who for 5 years didn't really make any money because they spent all of that money putting it into really high quality childcare, whether that's schools or nannies or other services, right? As compared to somebody who stepped out and just didn't make any money because they weren't engaged in the workforce. After those 5 years, or many people find themselves after 10 years trying to get back in, that person who stayed engaged in the workforce, even if they weren't like full on, they're in a much better earnings place, like a much better position to get a well-paid engaging job than is the person who stepped out of the workforce for that same period of time. And so I think it's really important to think about, I respect caregiving goals. Like there's a great friend of mine, Julia Baer, who wrote a wonderful article called Caregiving Ambition. Like I actually have enormous respect for caregiving ambition. But if you do have caregiving ambition, that doesn't necessarily need to be at the cost of some degree of professional engagement. And so it's really figuring out what are those roles. One of the things that was really interesting about those bending negotiations that I was describing, where you're trying to negotiate for something different than has existed before in the organization, what we found was that women did that more than men. And we only realized that after blind coding. So we really would have thought, kind of like you described, Stan, if anybody's working the system and getting special deals, it's like by stereotype the guys, right? But what we actually found was that it was women were more likely than men to say they had negotiated for something that was non-standard within the organization, a special exception, and that had to do with two things. One, work and family. So a lot of these women were getting up to levels in their careers where they just hadn't had people with significant caregiving responsibilities. And so these women were saying things like, you want me to take on this leadership role? I'd love to take on this leadership role, but my dad is aging and I'm going to be a better leader and ultimately, a better human and performer if I know I can go and spend, a week with him X times a quarter or once a month or whatever. And I can do this job remotely. Like I can be a leader and be checking in with people while I'm doing that. And so they ended up kind of crafting leadership roles that had never really, or work arrangements that had never existed before within the organization because they were combining those caregiving and professional ambitions. The other things that the women were doing also, though, is that some of them were coming out of non-traditional backgrounds. So everybody who's led this unit has been an engineer. I'm not an engineer, but I've got cross-functional team experience. I've got international experience. I have a vision for how to run the department. Like, give me a shot. Like, even if I don't look like the people who've done this before, give me a chance at doing that. So I think what I would give about, like, what negotiation advice do you give? It kind of goes back to this, what are your goals, right? And get out there and lean in and see if you can craft the journey that you want to follow. I mean, you were asking me in preparation, what are your stories? And I was reflecting, like, my most inspiring stories from working with people are those where they use negotiation to do things differently. To lead change. Maybe it's change within the organization. Maybe it's changing the way an organization manages work and family.
Yeah, and so women almost by necessity are going to engage in those bending types of negotiations because of their role with family. I think sometimes we homogenize the role of men and women in family, and I think it's just unrealistic. Certainly around pregnancy and early years of a child's life, men and women probably aren't interchangeable. What would you, if you could design a system that worked better for men and women in families, what does that system look like in this country? Because I'm discouraged that in the 30 years that we've been having this conversation, there hasn't been more progress at a systematic level.
Yeah. Well, actually something I feel very hopeful about, although it's not really more than a glimmer, is that there are so few things that we agree with along the political spectrum these days. But I think that work and family values are actually one of those things. I mean, I think there really would be a lot more potential. We are behind relative to other industrializations in terms of the quality of our work-family policies. And that is something that I think we're seeing movement toward. I would love to see more movement toward. The other thing that, although we're not like quote unquote there, and actually, can I back up a minute, Stan? Like equality, like what is equality, right? Equality is equality of opportunity, right? It's the idea that you could step forward and play the roles that you want to play in life, absent somebody pigeonholing you into a particular place, right? But we've never run that experiment. So we don't actually know that if you gave men and women the choice, you can choose the life that you want to lead, that you wouldn't actually see women choosing more often than men to pursue a greater degree of caregiving than men do. Like I don't think the 50-50, we shouldn't assume that somehow we get to this, that equality is the same as equal in the sense that that we're not making it if the world isn't 50-50. I mean, where I see really encouraging progress is in the attention to fathers I mean, there is a growing, now you're going to see this more in elite institutions than, and actually by unions, some more protection of unions of things like paternity leave than you do for less privileged workers. But there's definitely been a movement to give dads an opportunity to take time off after their, kids are born, and to kind of support that the caregiving ambitions of fathers as well as mothers. I think that's a really important direction. We want to kind of keep moving in that direction. I think the other reason why that's vitally important is that to the extent to which, the idea of flexible work arrangements or caregiving, to the extent to which it's just associated with women, it's not really a reflection of society, because men really care about this too. I mean, the younger generation, these young men in these classes that we have now, I don't know if you experienced this at Stanford, but I experienced this at Harvard. I mean, these guys are like, at the Harvard Kennedy School, we've got guys in like special forces. I mean, these are guys in like the ultimate, masculine roles. And they want to be there when their children are born. I mean, they want to have a role that is a little different than the assumption that the men are just out making pay or defending the nation. They also want to be involved in their family and those types of things. So I know we're not there. We're not there. I'm not sure what there looks like. Going back to if we ran the grand experiment and everybody got to choose, it's not clear to me that we'd see this perfect mix of men and women choosing, the same things exactly. But we are making progress. And I guess maybe that's my hopeful nature. I want to cling to those things where we're making progress.
I've reflected on stories. I have a student of mine who was an Olympic swimmer, and so no one would say that that's not ambitious. And he's the full-time stay-at-home dad of his daughter while his wife is running a company. And so you do see it more and more. I am skeptical, though, more than you, that we have put into place systems that give people real choice. I think most people, you highlight the difference between sort of highly educated white-collar workers versus maybe blue-collar workers. I don't think people have much choice in our system. And I think that's hurting women more than men, in my experience. It brings up an interesting point, though, which is conflict that gets created because of men and women in the workplace. I think, the way that you and I were raised, the roles were more clear. Now you have to negotiate the roles. I would say that my biggest conflicts with my wife come with how do we each perceive both our roles and our approaches to child rearing. And so what would you teach listeners about that negotiation? Because it is truly a negotiation for young couples of who plays what role and how they do that. I think it's, in my view, it's increasing conflict. Is that your experience?
So that is so interesting. I want to pick up on like three different pieces of that story and go back to like, it is hard. It's not just the systems and the policies though. Like it's the social norms. So like we talked about, changing men and women's opportunity to negotiate for the same levels of pay. If the women continue to encounter more resistance, then that's a barrier. That's a social norm. It's just sort of like a gut feeling. What's she doing? It's not a rule. I think the same thing applies to men. I mean, there is a sense of a kind of, it takes courage to do what your student is doing. It takes courage actually to be a stay-at-home dad. I like to use the example, we worry about women's treatment in boardrooms, but when I had little kids and there was a guy standing alone at the playground, I was checking out that guy to make sure he had a kid with him. I had some pretty ugly stereotypes. What was I thinking about? What was I projecting onto this poor guy who's just trying to take his kid to the yard? We have got to embrace men wanting to live up to their caregiving ambitions with their kids. And I think there's actually, if you look at the work of Richard Reeves and other folks who are out there saying, we need to do this not for women so women get paid more. We need to do this for men, and we need to do this for families. Like it's really good for kids. It's really good for wives. It's really good for families. And it's really good for men to give men more space to play those roles. And so I think that's vitally important. So going back to your couples, you have your couple, this couple, a lot of these professional couples, they get married, they want to support each other's aspirations. They're like, we're going to support each other's dreams. But then pretty quickly, they're having their first kid, and she's finding it a lot easier at work to negotiate for flexible arrangements. And he's finding it easier to negotiate for that extra pay and the raise. And, you got a kid who, gets through infancy and then preschool and maybe a second kid comes along. I mean, you are very quickly, within a few years, in a more traditional relationship than you imagined for yourselves. But part of that is not just about the decision making that you're doing together as a couple. It's about those norms, Stan, that you're talking about. It's the way that, organizations and social structures reinforce those roles. My pediatrician, whom I love and is a very progressive guy, but he said to me once, "Oh, I only give instructions to the mothers, about the kids. I only trust the mothers." And it was kind of loving and it was sweet, but it was also, gatekeeping the men out of that type of role. And so actually I've done some research on fathers, and it's made me realize, like, just little ways in which I need to invite my husband in, like, the school only has my email when announcements comes out and things like that, or the team, I'm the only one who gets the team announcements. And we've been changing that. So my husband has more space to, be involved, and he loves that. He's a great dad. But then you talk about in the couple, and I think you're right. I'm not a couples conflict person. I really look more at how people negotiate those boundaries of work and family. But part of my research has been to look at the fact that when you're negotiating work, you're in like the old Robert Putnam 2-level game. Like you're looking one way, negotiating with one person, but then you have these constituents you have to work with, and the constituents are the family. I mean, you don't ever, if you're in meaningful long-term relationships, whether that's with your the family you were born into or adopted into, or if it's the family you're choosing, you're very often consulting them about what are the life choices that you're making. And the more, what you and I have talked about before, it's one solution to that is you divide the labor. The men are going to be out, the men are going to negotiate. And then when I negotiate a deal with my boss that I'm going to move, you're going to move with me, and then you're going to work on this sort of separate realm of caring for the kids. And there are couples that think that that's really, like, that's the way they want to do it. And I totally respect that. But then in those couples where, like that couple, that my sort of imaginary couple where they come out of professional school and they have this idea we're going to support each other's careers, if they're not really explicit about what their goals are and they're not checking in with each other on a regular basis, they can slide into a place, as we were describing, that's more traditional and maybe not as satisfactory as they would have wanted, And so you really have to have, I think if you look at folks like John Gottman, or there's this brilliant woman, Jennifer Petrolieri, who wrote a book about called Couples That Work. John Gottman's a famous kind of psychologist of couples, relationships, and stability in marriage. But the core to what they get at is actually maybe going back to that first point about what are your goals? Like not only knowing what your own goals are, but really understanding in a kind of beautiful way what your partner's goals are too. So that you're always kind of returning to that. Jennifer, in this book, Couples That Work, has got she's got this idea of a list that you make out, of these things that you want to achieve in life. And you can imagine that sounding kind of like business schooly or academic or maybe even tedious. But she lays it out. She presents it in this very kind of romantic way and in this, I think, kind of very John Gottman-esque way of like, it's the heart of love to really be trying to be in tune with how your partner is growing in life and what their concerns are and their aspirations are. And it does require negotiation skills to then, I mean, your aspirations and goals are not always going to be in sync. Some couples trade. Maybe like your student who's the Olympic swimmer, maybe they have a plan to do a trade-off. I'm going to stay at home for a while you grow this business. You're going to sell your business, and then I'm going to have a shot, at doing my thing. Other couples try to work it out like together in the moment. Other couples decide that, it's better for our family if we divide the labor and you really focus on that extreme work commitment that's going to earn you a ton of money, and that's going to give us as a family, lots of exciting opportunities. So, but it is work. It's work.
Yeah, and I think that just acknowledging that is a negotiation. In my experience, most young couples do not negotiate over this, and it comes back to bite them later. And so I would literally recommend to young people, even when dating, to be explicit. Maybe, your framework, the S.U.R.E. framework that you outlined at the beginning would be a great one. And so it really has to be a dynamic process where each side recognizes that it is, in fact, an ongoing negotiation.
That and so something else that I also teach about is the imagined negotiation. So that's something I hear, sadly, from couples kind of all the time. And actually, Jeannie Suk Gerson at Harvard Law School writes about this. So she's kind of an attorney who does family law. But the imagined negotiation, I'll use the imagined negotiation with a story about myself, like at my own expense. But when I was graduating from the Kennedy School, like around the time we would have known each other, I spoke multiple languages. I had international work experience. I was getting recruited at one point by somebody at the State Department to say, oh, you should consider this kind of diplomatic route. And to my cringing embarrassment now, I remember saying, what guy is going to follow me all around the world while I pursue my diplomatic career? Like, family's actually really important to me. And I don't know how I'm going to work this out. So I didn't pursue that, but I ended up doing international work because that really was at my heart. And I met my husband that way. I met my husband doing international work, but it took me like some number of years to do that. And I joke with my students that maybe if I had, started circling the world faster as a diplomat, I might have met him sooner, but I didn't. What I had done in that moment with that guy from the State Department was that I had already conjured up in my head what my partner was. I'd never met him. And that I was going to lose that negotiation when it came time to have a conversation about, will you travel with me to my next exotic post as a diplomat? Like I imagined the whole thing like very rapidly in my head. And I basically decided I had failed. I decided I'd done close. And what you hear from couples is that they don't talk about some of those difficult things because they think they know what the other person is going to say.
Yeah.
They run it through their head. And they're like, I'm not going to bother because they're going to be irked, or I'm not going to bother because I know they're going to go along with me. And what Jeannie Suk Gerson warns about is that she argues couples really need to have these conversations when they're doing well, because when they're not doing well, it very often comes up that they were imagining different negotiations in their head.
Yep.
Like they hadn't done that work of really checking in with the other as to where the other one was, or that the other one didn't actually realize it was their next turn, or that they weren't going to get a turn, or they thought they were going to get a turn, or that, you just said you want to launch this business. I didn't know you're going to be like 15 years building this business, now where am I? So I think that's it's a very beautiful thing. People often think about negotiation as this like transaction and where we started, like about money. And I think it's actually a very important part of a loving relationship, of thriving careers and organizations. That's a passion for me.
Well, then maybe the two of us should teach a course on negotiating your career with your spouse. Lessons learned from Hannah and Stan on things that work well and things they would do differently.
Yeah. And then we got to invite a whole bunch of other people in because everybody's got a story.
Yeah. We're running out of time. I just want to touch on negotiating with parents and grandparents. That's an area that you and I have talked about in the past. What are some of your insights there?
We have new research where we were tracking on working mothers for 18 months, longitudinal data over 18 months, looking at how they were coping coming out of the pandemic. One of the things that's exciting about the data is that the people were socioeconomically diverse. So we've got working professionals and we've got people who are not college educated in maybe even gig work. But we expected to find big things going on with the socioeconomic differences, and we really didn't. The big thing that's popping right now in these data when we look at them is whether you have grandparents to help you out. I mean, whether you have an extended family in general, but grandparents in particular. And those, it's qualitative data. It's all exploratory. But the pattern that seems to be emerging is that, those women who, working mothers who had a grandparent in their lives, and it doesn't have to be a grandparent of theirs every day, but someone they know, oh my gosh, if I can't get home for the recital, or if I'm stuck at work and the kid's got a doctor's appointment, or my boss is making me travel and I need somebody to get up and make the kid, breakfast and pick them up at school and make them feel whole for a period of time where I have to go away. If they've got that extended family in their lives, that they are in our data set, at least, that they're more likely to be stably employed, whether they're stably employed full-time or part-time. And that, when I talk to people about that, they flood with stories of the importance that, particularly grandparents, but kind of extended family, have played in their ability to be, working parents. Again, to pursue that caregiving ambition alongside their professional aspirations.
Can we draw a link to what you said earlier about women not leaving the workforce full-time, that there are real costs financially and in terms of advancement, and having a grandparent to help them not leave? Is that a line that we can draw?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the big study that can say definitively that that's the case, but I think there's a lot of evidence, certainly anecdotal, and I think we see a pattern like that in some of the qualitative data that we have. That the women who don't have that family around, a lot of them were really hurting. In fact, some of them even said to us as we were doing these longitudinal interviews, we'd start off with saying, "How are you doing? Like, what's going on?" And I remember one participant said to one of our interviewers, "You're the only person who asked me that." And that is just hurts, I mean, having that, and sometimes also, okay, so we're not all blessed to have grandparents around, but there are ways we can also do that with, quote unquote, chosen family, neighbors and friends. And there are ways that we can really try to stand by each other. You can't, the traditional argument for why you needed women to stay home and care for family while men were out breadwinning was the realization that, working and having a family has all of these spillover costs. You need somebody grabbing the dry cleaning and, taking care of the kids and making the meals or doing whatever. Like, there's a lot of work that's involved actually to remain fully engaged in your professional life, entertaining your, clients or bosses, or, staying involved in a community. And so the women were playing this really important role for the advancement of men's careers. And the other thing that I kind of love about this grandparent perspective is it's saying, okay, who are those other loving family members that are making it more possible for working couples, not just, that necessarily that traditional nuclear family, but for working couples to, hold it all together.
There's so many directions we could go. You brought up Robert Putnam, and you and I both know Robert from Harvard, and he's just continued to be prolific and make a big difference. But, his primary work around the lack of community, his book, Bowling Alone, that people aren't intersecting, that this suburbanization in this country has led us to be distant, not only from our grandparents, but from each other. One example comes to mind. In college, I worked on a kibbutz in Israel, and obviously a collective situation there. And I just loved it. I just loved the idea that everyone raised each other's kids and was involved.
It's a very beautiful thing to see. But again, going back to the conversation that we were having at the beginning about career advancement and the engagement with work, how you're able to manage the household, like that family front, really has meaningful implications for your, over the years as we become more deeply entwined in our relationships. It has meaningful implications for our engagement with work as well.
It absolutely does. And because of these transitions, you and I think, would agree that people need more negotiation training. And so just to close out, a question I get frequently is, "Hey, Stan, I heard your lecture. I saw your podcast. Where do I go to get more knowledge of negotiation?" You must get that question all the time. Where do you send people?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a great question. I'd love for us to be working on expanding access to these types of things. I've been doing some work with the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, trying to get more of this stuff more available to younger people in their careers, because a lot of negotiation training is embedded within professional schools. I think it'd be really great if we were moving out and spreading these skills through not only undergraduate education, but also looking into community colleges and kind of, trying to reach out and extend this to broader communities. I think there are opportunities increasingly to do some of this stuff online. The program on negotiation at Harvard Law School now offers a lot of things online. You can find some of these things online. I think it's a really good question. If you love reading books, actually one book that I would recommend is Malhotra and Bazerman's. It's called Negotiation Genius. I have told them I don't love the title. I think particularly for people who are maybe, just trying to manage their home life, the idea of being a negotiation genius maybe I don't know, sound a little
It sounds
much.
like a title the editors would have come up with.
I know. I think probably the editors came up with it, but it is kind of genius. I mean, the book is excellent. The book has got so many good things in there. And actually, one tip that I'd love to share out of that book that I use, particularly when I'm working with young people or maybe people who don't feel particularly empowered, is that they talk about being an inquisitive negotiator. And we know this also from other people in the field that, making an offer in negotiation isn't always saying, pay me 100 or, I want 1.5, or it's not always about bids and asks. You can also negotiate by asking questions. You can also move a negotiation forward by saying, what are you really interested in? What do you care about? Well, what if we looked at this option? Would that meet your interests? Throwing out ideas and asking what norms are, what are the standards, what are the legitimate standards, going back to Roger Fisher, that you're using to make your decision. Negotiating around those norms and what works for people. That's a place where people often don't recognize that they're negotiating when they actually are.
Yeah, I think the question, help me understand your thinking, almost always is a good question in negotiation. So I think that's really wise. And I have not taken a look at that book. And well, Hannah, this has been great. Just really appreciate your time. It's so fun to connect on this as fellow warriors in the teaching negotiation field. And I just had a great time in our conversation today.
Oh, likewise, Dan. Great joy. So fun to reconnect. Thank you so much. And congratulations on this terrific series of conversations you've been leading.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to All Things Negotiation. Please subscribe to the show on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. If you enjoyed the show, tell a friend and be sure to engage with us on social media. Your likes, comments, and reposts make a big difference and help others find the show. The show was produced by Ezra Trupiano, original music by Peter Breinhold, and designed by Aubrey Benson. Thanks for listening.